Now, since we're studying laws of the Old Testament, it's important for us to understand the context of where all of these laws are coming from. You see, it's important for us to go back to the creation account wherein God has placed man in the Garden of Eden. Now, if you would go back to the book of Genesis, you would immediately realize that when God created man with his desire to have a relationship with them. All of us are hardwired for a relationship. Now, after God created Adam and Eve, he placed them in the Garden of Eden. Not only so that man would be able to live in a perfect environment, the very reason why God placed them in the Garden of Eden is so they'll have the opportunity to be able to experience communion with God. Man, literally, were able to walk and talk with God. Now, to be able to maintain this communion with God, because God is so holy, man was given a very simple commandment. And what was that commandment? It's recorded in Genesis chapter 2, beginning in verse 16 and 17. It says there, "And the Lord commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." That was a very simple commandment. For sure, there were so many trees in the Garden of Eden, but God only forbid them not to eat one of the trees, the fruit of the trees of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Unfortunately, man fell into sin, disregarded the commandment of the Lord, and so as a result, they were thrown out of the garden. Now, it's important for us to recognize that all of this were happening in the framework of relationship. When man was thrown out of the garden, God allowed them to live on their own, but at the same time provided additional commandments so that they'll be able to maintain relationship with God. Now, you and I have to recognize that all the laws were not given so that our lives would be oppressive. We were not given laws because God would like to make our lives miserable. But instead, God gave us laws so that we can foster and maintain a relationship with God. Now, Jesus Christ in the New Testament sheds some very important light with regards to this. Look at Matthew chapter 22, beginning in verse 35 to 40, because here you would understand where I'm coming from with the idea of relationship. Notice what it reads here. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." Now, notice what had happened here. At one point, when the Lord Jesus Christ was teaching, he was approached by one of the teachers of the law. He wanted to test the Lord Jesus Christ, and the question was, what's the greatest commandment of all the commandments in the law? And Jesus Christ responded by summarizing literally the commandments into two major commandments. The first commandment is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. That's the greatest commandment. And then he said the second commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. Now, if you notice, it's really about relationship. It's really about love. There's the vertical relationship, which is our relationship with God, and that you love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And then there's the God manward relationship, which is horizontal. We love others as we love ourselves. So, when you think about laws in the scriptures, please know they were given so that you will have a wonderful relationship, or if it's including our relationships manward, God's laws were provided so that you and I can experience wonderful relationships. 10 Commandments is the same. The first 4 commandments, vertical. The last 6 commandments, horizontal. Now, in order for us to be very clear, the laws were never given for our salvation. Romans chapter 3, verse 20 clearly talks about this. It says, "For by works of the law, no man or no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes the knowledge of sin." So, if you're thinking, if I do my best, obey all the laws, then God would accept me after I die. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. Why? Because if your salvation is dependent on you, you will never be saved. Why? Because God is so holy that you will have to fulfill all the commandments. James chapter 2 verse 10 talks about this. Listen to what James says. "For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it." Now, Pastor, what you're saying is, if I fulfill 9 of the 10 commandments, I'm still not acceptable with God. Absolutely. You see, 99% of obedience is not enough. Why? Because God is so holy. Now, please know that a violation of one law is not a violation against the law. It's a violation against the lawgiver. Did you get that? So if you disobey one law, you're still not going to be accepted by God. You're not going to be saved because it's not a violation against a specific law. You are violating the holiness of God. So, how can you and I be saved? Now, don't worry, because Romans chapter 8 answers that. Romans chapter 8, 3 and 4 says, "For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do, by sending his own Son in the likeness of the sinful flesh, and for sin he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit." So, listen. What the law has failed to accomplish, and that is to save you and I, Jesus Christ fulfilled. Now that's important. You see, when Jesus Christ came with the righteousness that is acceptable to the Father, He is the only one who has fulfilled the requirements of the law. And so, if you and I would like to be saved, if we want to go to heaven after we die, it's not by the fulfillment of the law, but by believing in what Jesus Christ had finished on the cross for us. Is that clear? Because even if you exert your best efforts, There's no way you can fulfill all the law. Only Jesus Christ has fulfilled all the law. That's the reason why it is very clear in the scriptures, if you would like to be saved, you will have to exercise faith on Jesus Christ. Then, Pastor, why are we studying the Ten Commandments if Jesus Christ has already fulfilled the law? Now, it's important that you and I recognize Jesus Christ fulfilled all the law, but the foundations why the law was given is still there. And what is that? So that you and I can have a wonderful relationship with God. If you would like to be close to God, you cannot ignore the laws of the scriptures. Why? Because the laws in your obedience can bring so much blessings into your life. That's the reason why we're studying the Ten Commandments. The first commandment is, you shall have no other gods. The second commandment is closely related. And this morning, we are diving into the second commandment that talks about having no idols. And there are fundamental elements with regards to this commandment that you and I should perfectly understand. Number one, idolatry covers the making and the worshiping of idols. Verses 8 and 9 of our main text, Deuteronomy chapter 5, says these words. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Now, let's first highlight that phrase, carved image. You see, idolatry is the manufacturing of pictures, images, or statues as objects of worship. Okay? So what are you not allowed to manufacture? Now listen to the passage again because it's very clear. No likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, which means no angels. And then it says on the earth beneath and in the water under the earth. So no picture, no image, no statues of all of these things. Now notice Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 15 to 19. If you're not satisfied with those explanations of what you're not allowed to manufacture, here is really a more vivid and more clear explanations of it. It says, therefore, watch yourselves very carefully, since you saw no form on the day that the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire. Beware lest you act corruptly in making a carved image for yourselves in the form of any figure, the likeness of a male or female, that's clear, the likeness of any animal that is on earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies on the air, the likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, or the likeness of any fish that is in the water under the earth. And beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun, moon, and the stars, all the host of the heaven, you'd be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the God, your Father, or your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole earth. Now, I don't think there's confusion with regards to what you and I are not allowed to manufacture or carve, right? No human image, no animal image, no fish, anything in the water, or nothing of the heavenly bodies should be worshipped. That's clear, right? Why? Now look at verse 15, because it says there, since you saw no form on the day that the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire. You see, the reason why God doesn't want you to come up with an image is because there's really no image that appropriately captures the greatness or the image of God. The Bible is so clear. God is a spirit. And so if you worship Him, you will have to worship Him in spirit and in truth. You have to be satisfied with the idea. And here's the idea. Nothing compares with God. That's the idea. So if you try to bring God to a simple image, then you're making that sin because you're trying to say, that's God. Right? God did not appear in any way. Now, how come, Pastor, when you go to the Old Testament, there are also some images that God has asked to be carved. For example, in the book of Exodus, Moses was also asked to carve an image of a serpent so that whenever people are being bitten by the serpent, they have to look at the serpent, the image of the serpent, and they would be healed. Now, please understand, that's the symbol of medicine today, the serpent, right? Please understand, God allowed them to carve an image, but that is not an image they have to worship. Even in the temple, in the Ark of the Covenant, there are images of cherubims in the Ark of the Covenant. 2 cherubim. Again, God instructed Moses to place that in the Ark of the Covenant, and that's not wrong. Why? Because God did not allow them to carve those images for the purpose of worship. And so if you would like to have a picture of your family member, that's good. Just don't put that picture in the midst of your house and bow down to that image and begin praying that your family member would save you or would protect you. Then that becomes idolatrous. Clear? So, you're allowed to have a picture. You're allowed to have an image. What you're not allowed to do is worship that image. Now, I hear some people say, but Pastor, when I worship that image, I really think of the Almighty God. Have you heard of that? Right? Now, let's put this in an illustration. If you're a wife and you walk into a room and your husband is hugging another woman, and as soon as he saw you, he stopped and turned to you and said, you see, I was thinking about you and I was hugging her. How many wives would buy that? Let me see your hand. You'd say, that's ridiculous. That's not acceptable. True? Oh, yeah. That's never acceptable. Why? Because that woman and you are very different. It's not the same. Same is true with God. Why would you bring God to a lower form when you really do not have the capacity to even begin portraying who God is? So don't limit that. Just be satisfied of the fact that even if you don't see Him, He's the greatest of all gods who created everything you see, who has continually sustained you, who have continually loved you, and who have continually desired that you maintain a good relationship with Him. Number 2, not only that idolatry covers the manufacturing, it's also important that we understand from our text, idolatry creates competition of affection. Now look at verse 9. In the midst of it, it says, "For the Lord your God, I'm a jealous God." Now, the reason why you and I really need to take heed of this particular commandment is because God specifically tells us that He doesn't want competition with regards to our affection. He demands absolute loyalty from us. Now, the verse in Isaiah chapter 42, verse 8, reinforces this. It says, "I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carve idols." So, what you and I really need to be careful with is that in idolatry, when you begin to bow down and worship an idol, the possibility is you're literally giving your loyalty and affection and devotion to that idol that only God deserves. And God says, I'm not going to share my glory to idols. Now, it's unfortunate that when you and I talked about jealousy, here's our idea. It's a negative emotion. Isn't it, in our idea, isn't it that jealousy is wrong? But the truth is, jealousy becomes wrong simply because many of us exercises jealousy without basis, without evidence of it. And so that makes it wrong. That makes it a negative emotion. But you see, when God sees you bowing to an idol, then there's a competition of affection and God will not accept it. Folks, as children of God, you and I need to understand God hates idols because once we begin to worship idols, it literally opens us to spiritual idolatry. It is equal to a married person having an extramarital relationship with another person, and that is not acceptable to God. Read the Old Testament, and you'd realize that one of the tragic part of Israel's history as a nation is that they have continually provoked God to anger because of their idolatry. Read Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 16 and 7. It says, "They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods. With abomination they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods that had never known, to new gods that have come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded." Imagine, in the history of Israel, again and again, they have literally stirred God to anger. Why? Because if there's a new fad, a new God, the nation is immediately accommodating new gods. Now, verse 17 is worth emphasizing. It says, they sacrifice to demons. Now, think about that for a minute. Do you know that demons love to possess idols? Manufactured images. Why? Because they know God hates idols, and in order to provoke God to anger, they would inhabit idols. And when people worship their idea of gods, they don't realize that they're worshiping demons. Is that really true, Pastor? Yeah. That's the reason why you and I should not be surprised. There are always stories of images performing supernatural miracles. Now, don't be fooled. God is not going to uh, create something supernatural out of an idol that he hates. If there's a miracle that it's coming from the idol, it's definitely coming from demonic spirits. How do we know that? Look at, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. The Apostle Paul talks about this truth. He says, what do I imply then? That food offered to idols is everything? Or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You see, during the olden times, it's been their practice when they're worshiping their pagan gods that they would place edible foods, thinking if the gods want to eat, then they'll eat this food. Unfortunately, for those people who are offering foods to pagan gods, the Bible is clearly saying you're not really offering those foods to God. You're offering those foods to idols who are inhabited by demonic spirits. That's clear, right? So, you and I should never worship idols. Why? Because God hates it. Because God is a jealous God. Now, let's make an application. I know that many of you don't have images or idols in your homes. You no longer bow down to images. But is it possible that you have maintained idols in your hearts this morning? Now, we need to take the opportunity to constantly examine our hearts so that we do not fall into what I call competition of affection. You see, anything that you put as more important than God is an idol. Are you willing to accept that? Anything that you put more important than God is an idol. Which means that idol could be your family, a family member. It's possible, that your family has become more important to you. That they have taken the place of God, or your career, or pleasure. You see, I have seen people who are so passionate about sports that sports have become their God. Basketball or golf or, whatever that source of pleasure is. Young people, video games. Sometimes I don't understand how young people could sit in hours and hours of video game and then they complain for an hour and a half service. Does that make sense to you, guys? Now, we have to be careful because these things could literally be a competition of affection or possibly goals or aspirations. We're driven to go up to the ladder to the extent that we sacrifice our relationship with God. Now, please listen to me. I'm not here trying to make condemnations, but to provide an opportunity for conviction. Because you and I could be as guilty as the people of the Old Testament who bowed down before images. And God said, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Now, the reason why this is important is because the third element. The third element is that idolatry causes corruption and curse. Now listen to the words in verse 9. It says here, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Now, before I explain this, let me first ask you, do you believe that God will always be true to His words? We all know God is faithful to His words, right? So if God says, I'm going to punish you up to the third and fourth generation of your family if you do not quit idolatry, then you and I should listen. Why? Because the third and fourth generation, if I'm thinking of my family, that would be my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. That because I have turned my heart away from God, then the sin that I have committed can be passed down to them. Now, I need to explain this to you in saying that because parents are not careful, it's possible that that sin literally is passed down to their children, and their children passes it down to their children, and their grandchildren will pass it down to their children. And so there's a generational sin that is taking place. Not because God wants to punish this family up to the third and fourth generation, but you have to understand it's more of the influence. If you do not make your life right now, it's possible that your children will copy exactly what you're doing, and because of what you're doing, they'll be punished by the Lord, and their children will copy your children, and their children will copy their parents. That's the idea of it. Now, if you do not believe me, look at 2 Kings. Now, I know this is a long read, but I'll just read them quickly for you. But this is a perfect example of what we're talking about. It says here, and this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations, whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel has practiced. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. Let me just stop here. I just want to explain to you, whenever they built their altars before, they usually would go up to the hill, and that's where they worship. That's just what it says here. They set up for themselves pillars and asherim on every high hill and every green tree, and they had made offerings on all the high places as the nations did, whom the Lord carried away before them. And they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. And they served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this. Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes, and in accordance to all the law that I have commanded your fathers, and that I sent to you by my servants, the prophets. But they would not listen, but were stubborn, as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant, and he made with their fathers, and the warnings that gave them. They went after false idols and became false, and they followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do like them. And they abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made for themselves metal images of 2 calves. And they made an Asherah, which is a goddess, an idol during the Old Testament, and worshiped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. And they buried their sons And they burned their sons and their daughters as offerings, and used divination and omens, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel and afflicted them and gave them to the hand of the plunderers until he had cast them out of his sight. Now, listen. As soon as they left Egypt in Exodus, God has already told them what they needed to do. Unfortunately, because the ancestors, the fathers, were not careful, it came to the point that this nation was so corrupted that they were literally burning their own children as offerings to the idols. Can you imagine the corruption? Now, I just want to make a comment, and I hope you hear this, okay? When you fall victims to idolatry, you're also going to make sacrifices to false gods. Don't be fooled that only Jehovah God will ask sacrifices from you. Whoever is the God you have chosen, you will have to make a sacrifice. If you make your career your God, you're going to make a sacrifice for your career. If you're going to make your family God, you're going to make sacrifices to whatever gods you choose. You don't realize that false gods would even ask you greater sacrifices. God would not ask you to burn your children, but false gods do. I hope we wake up. But you see, I should not stop with the curse of God visiting sin to the third and fourth generation. But if you continue to read, and this is where I'd like to really end, it says in the passage, okay, verse 10, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me, to keep my commandments. Now, would you agree that there's a huge difference between third and fourth generation and 1,000 generations? What God is saying is, if you would choose to be faithful to God today, the blessings that God will give your family will reach out up to 1,000 generations. And I love that. You see, God is always faithful. And if you're willing to believe Him that He can punish those who are idolaters, you also need to believe that God could bless those who are faithful. You just have to choose where to stand. Would you stand on the idolatrous, or would you stand on the faithful? Oh, this is the reason why I'd like to really challenge all the parents, all the grandparents who are here this morning. Don't make that mistake of turning to an idol. Whatever idol it is, it's not worth it. Why? Because you don't want God or God's anger to be upon your life. What you want is for God's blessings to overflow to you, to your children, to your grandchildren, up to 1,000 generations. And I will always be grateful for that. You see, I'm a son of a pastor. And I believe with all my heart, many of the blessings I enjoy today is because my parents were faithful to the Lord. And I hope that one of these days my children would be able to say as well, they're blessed because their parents had been faithful to the Lord. And my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, because that's the reality for us. God's blessings can overflow in our lives or in the lives of the faithful up to 1,000 generations. Would you pray this morning, asking the Lord to give you the grace not to be deceived by other gods, by idols, and make that commitment. Talk to God this morning and tell Him, Lord, preserve me and protect me so that I do not fall into this sin of worshiping other gods. Most gracious and loving Father, I recognize that our hearts could be deceived and that oftentimes we run after wrong things. I pray this morning that you would protect each one of us from the youngest person who is in this room to the oldest person in this room. I pray that we will not make the mistake of running after false gods, that we will not manufacture our own gods in our hearts, but truly surrender our lives to you. Oh God, as a father, this morning I pray that you would continue to work in my family, in the lives of my children, in the lives of my grandchildren, that they will not turn their hearts from you. I pray for all the parents who are here, all the grandparents who share this desire in their hearts with me. I pray that we can make that commitment in our hearts this morning, that we only serve and worship the one true God who has saved us and who has given the best for us, His Son, Jesus Christ. I pray that you would bless your words in our hearts. In Jesus' name.